Okay, so most of that stuff focused on liquids evaporating and dealing with vapor pressures. Now let's switch over and talk a little bit about solids. There are two different kinds of solids. There are crystalline solids, which encompasses most of the solids in the world, and there are things called amorphous solids. Amorphous solids are non-crystalline solids. Sometimes they're called glasses or supercooled liquids. Amorphous solids are different because A means without and morphous means a definite configurational arrangement. When we think of solids, I kind of think of sugar cubes. Have you ever seen those? You know what sugar cubes are, right? Just all stacked up like little building blocks. And I think of crystalline solids like that. But amorphous solids aren't like that. They are different because they are long, twisted molecules, and they just kind of wrap themselves up and lay all over each other. When I think of this, I think of snakes. If you've ever been to the zoo or maybe somewhere out in the woods and seen a bunch of snakes, they don't lay around together and line up in a row like little sticks. They lay in a pile, and they're all twisted with their tails intertwined and just sort of moving around or sunning themselves, whatever. So that is what an amorphous solid is like. And because they are all twisted up, they do not have sharp melting points. They have transition temperatures where they start to soften. And the classic example of this is glass. Okay? You all know glass, what it looks like. And I don't know if you've done some experiments when you took your very first intro class. You probably did some glass blowing where you put a stirring rod in and you might have stretched it, or you might have done some fire polishing. Those are freshman chemistry kind of things or intro chemistry kind of things. So you see that when you put it in the fire, it just gradually gets soft. It doesn't have a sharp melting point. If you put an ice cube in the fire, it would just turn to water. It would quickly melt, right? But if you put glass in there, it glows red and gets soft, and you can twist it and pull on it. So that's an amorphous solid. And I always think of a couple of things when I talk about amorphous solids. Because these things are glasses and they are supercooled liquids, they actually have movement in them. And the example of this is old glass. You go into some really old churches and things, and you look at it, and the glass looks kind of wavy and bubbly. And if you really look closely, sometimes you'll see it's thicker on the bottom. That's because over time, the glass actually moves down, and it actually does get thicker. And I remember first time that I started really noticing things in the world, I looked at that and thought, oh, back in the old days, they didn't know how to make glass as nicely as they do now. That must be why it's thicker on the bottom. And that may be partly true. That may be why there's bubbles in it and things like that. But we had an experience when Bob and I were newlyweds. We didn't have a lot of money, and we were trying to furnish our home. So we were digging around in thrift shops and in his parents' basement. And we found an antique china cabinet that belonged to Bob's great-great-grandparents. It had been painted many times and relegated to the basement where it was holding extra canned goods. So we got a steel shelf for the canned goods. We pulled the china cabinet out, and we spent our first summer together as a married couple, lovingly refurnishing, stripping this and then redoing it. And near the end of the summer, when we had it almost done, we had cleaned it, we had scrubbed it, we had steel wooled it, we had stained it, varnished it, and it was lovely. We rubbed in the paste wax, and finally we're ready to set it up in our home. And we were putting the furniture or the knobs on because it was some of the knobs were missing, so we bought new reproduction for the period knobs. So the day we're going to set it up in our house, the glass was dirty, and Bob says, okay, I'll clean the glass. I'm like, okay, I'll put the knobs on. So I go in there, I get in front of the cupboard. He takes the glass out. I get down there, and I'm putting the knobs on the lower cupboard, sitting there like this. I got my little screwdriver, screwing things on. And I'm looking at it, and I'm rubbing my hands over the wood because it was lovely. And then I stood up, and I heard this sickening crunching sound as I stepped on the glass that he had put behind me on the floor. And he had something to say about that. I think he said, darling, I believe you just stepped on that glass from the old china cabinet that I cleaned. And I think my response was, why, I believe I did. I'm quite shocked that I found it on the floor under my foot. It was something like that. It was probably our first and most vocal marital dispute. Maybe not the most. I think it was probably maybe a close second to the day that I told him I could not hold the garage door up any longer when we were restringing it. I'm standing there holding the wooden door, and I said, I can't hold this anymore. And he says, oh, just a few minutes. I'm almost done with the wiring. And I'm like, no, I have to let go. I can't hold this anymore. I am letting go when I count to 3. And so I started counting, and he jumped down, and I let go, and he put his hands under it to try and catch it. What a dumb thing is that, right? Anyway, then he got mad at me because he thought it was somehow my fault that he had 4 broken fingers. Who puts their hand under a garage door when it's being dropped, besides Bob? Anyway, so back to the glass. So now we have broken glass. We have a fight. We're cleaning up the mess. We had to go buy new glass. We put the new glass in one side. The old glass is in the other side. And it was upsetting because you could really see the difference. And when we pulled the old glass and we're putting it back in, I really looked at it and I thought, wow, it was noticeably thicker, visually thicker. So I ran and got a micrometer because Bob had a bunch of tools and measuring stuff. I got a micrometer and actually measured the thickness on the bottom and the top. I wrote the numbers down. I measured the new glass, top and bottom. They were pretty close. Wrote the numbers down. We put the glass in. I turned the old glass upside down, and I wrote the date on it. And I said, in 50 years, we will come back and look at this. We're going to wait 50 years, and then we'll come back and remeasure it. So we're going to have our 40th wedding anniversary next month in May. So we got 10 years to go, and then I can go measure that. And a couple times I sneaked in there and looked at it to see. But I haven't measured it yet, so I'm really excited for that, to see if it went back, because glass does move, and I want to see if there's an appreciable difference. And when our kids were teenagers, I finally showed them this paper where I had written all this down and said, now on this date, 50 years from now, you have to come back and measure this if I'm not here. If something goes wrong and I can't measure it, or your dad and I aren't here anymore, then it's your job to measure this. And they're like, well, how are we going to tell you? I'm like, I think I'll know. I think. So that's amorphous solids. And there aren't very many things that are amorphous. So most of our discussion will be on crystalline solids. Now, when we look in crystalline solids, there are lots of different types of crystal lattices. And we talk about the lattice. It is based on the unit cell. The unit cell is the smallest piece in the lattice, and the lattice is defined by that. There are 7 types of Bravais lattices, 7 basic, and they make 14 space-filling Bravais lattices. For our purposes, we are going to deal only with the cubic. We're going to talk about the cubic cell, and this is an example of a cube. And when we look at this, we'll talk about simple, body-centered, and face-centered. When we look at things that make crystal lattices, some of them can be in more than one crystal state, like phosphorus. There's red phosphorus and yellow phosphorus. Those are different crystal lattice forms. Sulfur also does this. It can be monoclinic or rhombohedral, and we're not going to worry about those names, but I've got them there if you want to go look them up. If you have a simple cubic cell, you have a simple cubic lattice. So we're going to focus on this simple body-centered, face-centered business.